The silence in Valerian Lawson's life was as vast as the Wyoming territory that stretched before him, until the day a letter arrived promising to change everything. The year was 1872, and like many men who had staked their claim in South Pass City, Wyoming, Valerian had conquered the wilderness but found himself desperately alone in a home that echoed with emptiness. The wind howled across the rolling prairie as Valerian stood at the train station, his weathered Stetson clutched tightly in his calloused hands. His 30 years of life had been marked by hard work and solitude, building a modest cattle ranch just outside of town. The advertisement he had placed in the Eastern newspaper had been answered by one Miss Theodora Nichols of Boston, Massachusetts. Their exchange of letters had been brief but promising, and now he found himself anxiously awaiting her arrival. The train's whistle pierced the air, and Valerian straightened his best shirt, which still bore the wrinkles from being folded in his trunk for too long. As the locomotive rumbled to a stop in a cloud of steam and coal smoke, passengers began to disembark. His eyes scanned the platform, looking for a woman who matched the description in her letters, 22 years of age with auburn hair. She was easy to spot, standing uncertainly at the edge of the platform, her green traveling dress a splash of color against the dusty landscape. She was smaller than he had imagined, with delicate features and wide, alert eyes that darted around the station. Her auburn hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, and she clutched a small valise in her gloved hands. Valerian approached her with measured steps, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Miss Nichols?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. She did not respond, continuing to scan the platform with increasing anxiety. "Miss Nichols." He repeated, louder this time, stepping directly into her line of sight. Her eyes found his, and relief washed over her features. She nodded vigorously, then reached into her reticule to withdraw a small notebook and pencil. With quick, practiced movements, she wrote something and held it up for him to read. "I am Theodora Nichols. You must be Mr. Lawson. I apologize for any confusion. I am deaf." Valerian stared at the note, the words swimming before his eyes as comprehension dawned. His mail-order bride was deaf. In all their correspondence, she had never mentioned this fact, and he had never thought to ask about such a thing. For a moment, he considered the implications. Life on the frontier was hard enough for those with all their faculties. How would a deaf woman manage? But as he looked into her expectant face, he saw intelligence and determination in her eyes. He took the notebook from her and wrote his reply. "Yes, I am Valerian Lawson. Welcome to South Pass City, Miss Nichols." Her smile was radiant as she read his words, and something shifted in Valerian's chest. He had expected complications when taking a bride sight unseen, but not this. Yet there was something about her evident courage that stirred his admiration. He gestured toward her trunk, which a porter had set down nearby, and she nodded her understanding. Valerian hoisted it onto his shoulder, then indicated with a tilt of his head that she should follow him to his wagon. The ride to his ranch was silent in more ways than one. Theodora sat beside him on the bench, her back straight, taking in the rugged landscape with wide-eyed wonder. Occasionally, she would touch his arm and point to something a hawk circling overhead, a distant herd of pronghorn, her face alight with discovery. Valerian found himself wanting to tell her about this land, about the challenges and the beauty of the West, but the barrier of her deafness loomed between them. He would have to find another way to communicate. As they approached his ranch, he saw it through her eyes, the modest 2-story house he had built with his own hands, the barn and corrals, the garden plot now lying dormant in the autumn chill. It wasn't much compared to what she might have known in Boston, but it was solid and honest like him. Theodora's hand flew to her mouth as she took in the homestead, and for a moment, Valerian feared disappointment. But when she turned to him, her eyes were shining, and she quickly wrote in her notebook, "It's beautiful." "Did you build it yourself?" Pride swelled in his chest as he nodded. Perhaps this unusual arrangement might work after all. That evening, after showing Theodora to the small bedroom he had prepared for her, they would not share a room until after they were married, which they had agreed would happen after a month of acquaintance. Valerian sat at his kitchen table with an oil lamp burning low. He pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. "Dear Mr. Jenkins, I need to learn how to speak with my hands." Howard Jenkins was the schoolteacher in South Pass City, a learned man who had spent time in the East before coming west. If anyone would know about communicating with the deaf, it would be him. The next morning, Valerian rose early, as was his habit, and found Theodora already awake, attempting to start the stove for coffee. He approached carefully, not wanting to startle her, and gently touched her shoulder to make his presence known. She turned with a smile, pointing to the stove with a questioning look. Valerian demonstrated how to properly adjust the damper, and she watched his movements intently, then mimicked them perfectly. He nodded his approval, and her smile widened. Over a simple breakfast of biscuits and coffee, they attempted to communicate through written notes. It was slow and cumbersome, but Valerian learned that Theodora had been born hearing, but had lost her ability to hear at the age of 5 due to scarlet fever. She had attended a special school in Boston, where she had learned to read lips somewhat, and to communicate through writing and sign language. When he inquired why she had not mentioned her deafness in her letters, she wrote, "I feared you would reject me if you knew. Many men have. I hope that by the time you discovered the truth, you might see that I can be a good wife despite my condition." Valerian considered her words carefully before responding. "You should have told me, but I understand your fear. We will find a way to make this work." Relief flooded her features, and she reached across the table to touch his hand in gratitude. After breakfast, Valerian needed to check on his cattle. He explained through writing that he would be gone for a few hours but would return for the midday meal. Theodora nodded and indicated that she would familiarize herself with the house and perhaps begin some cleaning. As he rode out, Valerian's thoughts were consumed with the unexpected turn his life had taken. He had wanted a companion, a helpmate, someone to share the burden of building a life in this wild country. Could Theodora be that person, despite her inability to hear? The question weighed on him as he rode the boundaries of his land. When he returned to the house, he found it transformed. The floors had been swept, the surfaces dusted, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. Theodora had found his meager supplies and had somehow created a hearty stew that was simmering on the stove. She greeted him with a shy smile, pointing proudly to her accomplishments. Valerian was impressed. She had done more in a morning than he sometimes managed in a week. After washing up, they sat down to the meal she had prepared. Valerian bowed his head for a brief prayer, and Theodora respectfully did the same, though she couldn't hear his whispered words. The stew was delicious, seasoned with herbs she must have found in his neglected garden. As they ate, Valerian realized that he had never felt so strongly the limitations of words written on paper. There was so much he wanted to express, questions he wanted to ask, thoughts he wanted to share. The pencil and paper method was too slow, too formal for the kind of everyday communication that built a relationship. That afternoon, while Theodora rested, Valerian rode into town to find Mr. Jenkins. The schoolteacher was surprised by Valerian's request, but agreed to help. "I know a little of the manual alphabet," Jenkins said, leafing through a book on his shelf. It was developed for the deaf. Each letter has a corresponding hand shape. With practice, you can spell out words. Valerian watched intently as Jenkins demonstrated, forming different shapes with his hand to represent each letter of the alphabet. There's also a more complex system of signs that represent entire words and concepts, Jenkins continued, but that would take much longer to learn. The alphabet is a good place to start. Valerian spent an hour practicing the manual alphabet under Jenkins's tutelage, his large, work-roughened hands initially clumsy with the precise movements required. But he was determined, and by the time he left, he had memorized enough to make a beginning. Jenkins also loaned him a slim volume titled The Language of Signs, a primer for communication with the deaf. The book was basic but would be a valuable resource. When Valerian returned home, he found Theodora in the garden, clearing the remnants of summer's vegetation in preparation for winter. She looked up as his shadow fell across her, shielding her eyes against the late afternoon sun. Instead of reaching for the notebook, Valerian slowly formed the shapes he had learned, spelling out Hello. Theodora's face lit up with astonishment and joy. She quickly stood, wiping her hands on her apron, and signed back, her fingers moving with the fluidity of long practice. Seeing his confusion, she smiled and slowed her movements, deliberately spelling out Youknowsign. Valerian shook his head and indicated that he was just learning. She clasped her hands together in delight, and then, to his surprise, reached out and took his hands in hers. Gently, she repositioned his fingers to correct his signing of hello, then guided him through the sign again. That evening marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship. After their simple supper, they sat at the kitchen table with the book Jenkins had loaned him. Theodora patiently showed Valerian the proper way to form each letter, correcting him when necessary, praising him when he got it right. Her touch was light but electric, sending unfamiliar sensations through Valerian's body. He had lived so long without human contact that the simple act of her fingers guiding his was profoundly affecting. As the days passed, Valerian devoted every spare moment to learning to sign. It became a ritual after the morning chores, and again in the evening. They would sit together, hands moving in the lamplight as she taught him new signs and corrected his attempts. Theodora proved to be an excellent teacher, patient but insistent on proper form. She had a gift for breaking down complex signs into manageable parts, and she never showed frustration when Valerian struggled with a particularly difficult movement. For his part, Valerian discovered that he had an aptitude for languages. His hands, so accustomed to the rough work of ranching, gradually became more nimble and expressive as he mastered the basics of signing. As his skills improved, their communication expanded beyond simple phrases. Valerian learned to sign about his daily work, the cattle, the repairs needed around the ranch, his plans for expansion. Theodora shared stories of her life in Boston, her family, now deceased, which had prompted her decision to come west, and her dreams for the future. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, a storm blew in from the mountains. The wind howled around the eaves of the house, and rain lashed at the windows. Thunder shook the very foundations, but of course, Theodora couldn't hear it. Valerian was checking that the windows were secure when a particularly violent thunderclap rattled the house. He glanced at Theodora, who was calmly mending one of his shirts by the fire, completely unaware of the tumult outside. It struck him then, with unexpected force, how different her experience of the world was from his own. She lived in perpetual silence, missing both the alarming sounds of danger and the comforting sounds of life: birdsong, laughter, music, the whisper of wind through grass. Yet she did not seem diminished by this difference. If anything, she seemed more attuned to other aspects of life. She noticed things he often overlooked: the changing patterns of light throughout the day, the expressions that flitted across his face, the subtle shifts in the behavior of the animals. As he watched her serene face in the firelight, Valerian realized that he was beginning to care for Theodora in a way that went beyond the practical arrangement they had made. Her courage, her adaptability, her gentle determination, all these qualities were endearing her to him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The next day dawned clear and fresh after the storm. Valerian had work to do repairing some fences that had been damaged, and Theodora insisted on accompanying him. She donned a pair of his old trousers under her skirt, much to his amusement, explaining through signs that she couldn't very well help if she was tripping over her hem. As they worked side by side, Valerian was impressed by her strength and practical nature. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty, and she quickly learned how to hold the rails steady while he hammered them into place. During a break, they sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree, sharing a canteen of water and some bread and cheese Theodora had packed. Valerian found himself studying her profile, the delicate curve of her jaw, the way the sun brought out the copper highlights in her hair. When she turned and caught him looking, he didn't glance away as he might have once done. Instead, he slowly signed, "You are beautiful." A blush rose to her cheeks and she ducked her head, but not before he caught the pleased smile that curved her lips. After a moment, she signed back, "You are handsome too." It was Valerian's turn to be embarrassed. No one had ever called him handsome before. He was too tall, too angular, his features too stern for conventional good looks. But the way she looked at him made him believe that perhaps, to her, he was. That night, as they sat before the fire, Theodora surprised him by producing a small book from her trunk. It was worn with use, the pages dog-eared and marked. She handed it to him shyly. It was a dictionary of sign language, much more comprehensive than the primer Jenkins had loaned him. Inside the cover was an inscription. "To my dearest Theodora, may these signs give voice to your thoughts and feelings. With all my love, Mother." Valerian understood that this was a precious gift, not just the book itself, but the trust she was placing in him by sharing something so personal. "Thank you," he signed, and then haltingly, "This means much to me." Her smile was worth all the hours of practice, all the frustration of learning a new language. In that moment, Valerian knew that whatever happened between them, he would never regret having made the effort to bridge the gap of silence that separated them. The following Sunday, Valerian suggested they attend church in town. He had never been particularly religious, but it was the social center of the community, and he wanted to introduce Theodora to his neighbors. She agreed readily, though she confessed through signs that she was nervous about meeting so many new people. "Will they think I am strange?" she asked, her hands forming the signs with a slight tremor. "They will think you are brave," Valerian signed back, "and if they do not, they are fools." The simple wooden church was filled when they arrived, and heads turned as Valerian escorted Theodora to a pew near the back. He was conscious of the curious glances, the whispers behind hands. South Pass City was small, and news traveled fast. Most people knew that Valerian Lawson had sent for a mail-order bride, but her arrival had been so recent that few had met her. The service proceeded as usual, with Reverend Thompson leading the congregation in hymns and prayers. Theodora sat quietly beside Valerian, her eyes on the Reverend's lips, trying to follow along as best she could. When it came time for the sermon, Valerian surprised both Theodora and himself by beginning to sign the Reverend's words for her. His signing was still basic and sometimes clumsy, but he managed to convey the essence of the message about faith and perseverance. Theodora's eyes shone with gratitude, and she squeezed his arm in silent thanks. Valerian was so focused on translating for her that he didn't notice the reactions of those around them, some puzzled, some curious, a few disapproving, but many touched by the obvious care he was taking to include her. After the service, Reverend Thompson approached them. "Mr. Lawson," he said, nodding politely, "and this must be your bride-to-be." Valerian introduced Theodora, explaining her condition and their method of communication. The Reverend, to his credit, showed no surprise or discomfort. Instead, he spoke directly to Theodora, making sure she could see his lips, and then asked Valerian to translate his welcome to the community. Others followed the Reverend's lead, coming forward to meet Theodora. Some were awkward, not knowing how to interact with someone who couldn't hear them, but many made genuine efforts to welcome her. Mrs. Peterson, the midwife, even knew a few signs, having once cared for a deaf child, and she and Theodora had a brief, animated exchange that left both women smiling. Not all reactions were positive. Valerian overheard Bartholomew Quinn, the town's most prominent businessman, muttering to his wife about damaged goods and deceitful advertising. Quinn caught Valerian's eye and had the grace to look abashed, but the damage was done. Valerian was seething as he helped Theodora into the wagon for the ride home. She must have sensed his anger, for she touched his arm questioningly. "What is wrong?" she signed. Valerian hesitated, not wanting to hurt her with the truth of Quinn's comments. But their relationship, unusual as it was, had been built on honesty. "Some people do not understand," he signed carefully. "They say unkind things because they fear what is different." Theodora's face fell, but then she straightened her shoulders. "I have heard, or rather seen, such things all my life," she signed. "It does not matter what they think, only what you think." Her resilience humbled him. "I think you are remarkable," he signed, and was rewarded with a smile that made the sun seem dim by comparison. As they drove home, Valerian reflected on how much his life had changed in just 2 weeks. His house, once a place of lonely routine, now felt like a home. The silence that had been his constant companion was now filled with a new kind of communication, visual, tactile, and in many ways more intimate than speech had ever been. The day of their planned wedding was approaching, and Valerian found himself looking forward to it not out of duty or practicality, but out of a genuine desire to make Theodora his wife. They had agreed on a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Reverend Thompson officiating and just a few neighbors as witnesses. 3 days before the wedding, disaster struck. Valerian was mending a section of the barn roof when a rotted beam gave way beneath him. He fell nearly 15 feet, landing hard on the packed earth floor. Pain exploded in his left leg, and he knew immediately that it was broken. He tried to call out for Theodora, forgetting in his agony that she wouldn't hear him. For long moments he lay there, gritting his teeth against the pain, wondering how he would attract her attention. But Theodora, ever observant, had seen him ascend to the roof and had been periodically checking on him. When she came to the barn door and saw him lying there, she rushed to his side, her face pale with concern. She knelt beside him, her hands gentle as they examined his injured leg. Valerian could see the fear in her eyes, but there was also determination. She signed quickly, "Do not move." "I will get help." Before he could respond, she was gone. Valerian lay back, trying to control his breathing against the waves of pain. He had never felt so helpless, so vulnerable, and yet there was a strange comfort in knowing that Theodora was taking charge of the situation. She returned within minutes, bringing water and clean cloths. She bathed his face, which was clammy with sweat from the pain, and then signaled that she was going for the doctor. Valerian tried to protest the town was 5 miles away, but she was already moving, her decision made. What Valerian didn't know was that Theodora had already thought this through. She couldn't ride to town for the doctor, she had never learned to ride, and even if she had, she wouldn't be able to hear approaching dangers or calls for her to stop. Instead, she went to their nearest neighbor, the Wilsons, a mile down the road. She couldn't call out for help when she arrived, so she banged on their door with desperate force. Eliza Wilson, a kind-hearted woman in her 50s, opened the door to find a wild-eyed Theodora gesturing frantically. Although she didn't understand sign language, Eliza could see that something was terribly wrong. She called for her husband, and together they managed to understand that Valerian was injured. Robert Wilson saddled his horse immediately and rode for the doctor, while Eliza accompanied Theodora back to the ranch in their wagon. By the time they arrived, Valerian was feverish with pain. Eliza, who had raised 6 children and dealt with her share of injuries, helped Theodora splint his leg as best they could while they waited for the doctor. Throughout it all, Theodora remained calm and focused. She wiped Valerian's brow with cool cloths, gave him water to sip, and kept signing reassurances that help was coming. Dr. Morris arrived 2 hours later, a gruff but competent man who had served as a surgeon during the Civil War. He examined Valerian's leg and confirmed what they already suspected, a clean break that would need to be set. "This will hurt, son," Dr. Morris warned, "but it needs to be done." Valerian nodded, bracing himself. Theodora, understanding what was about to happen, positioned herself at Valerian's head, her hands on either side of his face, forcing him to look at her. As the doctor prepared to set the bone, she began to sign, drawing Valerian's attention away from what was happening with his leg. "Focus on me," she signed. "Tell me about your childhood. Tell me about your first horse." Even through the haze of pain, Valerian was touched by her strategy. He began to sign back, describing the pony his father had given him when he was 8. The memory was vivid, the smell of the horse, the feel of its mane between his fingers, the exhilaration of his first gallop. When the doctor wrenched his leg to align the broken bone, Valerian's world exploded in agony. He might have screamed, he wasn't sure. But through it all, Theodora's eyes held his, her hands continuing to sign encouragement and distraction. After the bone was set and his leg splinted properly, the doctor gave him laudanum for the pain and instructed him to stay off the leg for at least 6 weeks. "You're lucky, doctor," Morris said as he packed up his bag. "A fall like that could have killed you or left you with injuries far worse than a broken leg." Valerian knew it was true. He also knew that the timing couldn't have been worse. With winter approaching, there was so much work to be done around the ranch: wood to be chopped, repairs to be made, cattle to be moved to winter pasture. As the doctor left, promising to return in a week to check on the leg, Valerian's mind was racing with concerns. How would he manage the ranch? How could he expect Theodora to take on so much responsibility when she was still adjusting to life in the West? And what of their wedding? They would have to postpone it now, surely. The thought brought an unexpected pang of disappointment. That evening, after the Wilsons had gone home and Valerian was settled in his bed with his splinted leg propped on pillows, Theodora came to sit beside him. The laudanum had dulled the worst of the pain, leaving him drowsy but lucid. "I am sorry," he signed, his movements sluggish from the medication. Theodora tilted her head questioningly. "For what?" "For being a burden. For not being able to protect and provide as I promised." Her expression softened and she reached out to take his hand. "You are not a burden," she signed firmly. You are the man I have chosen to marry, in sickness and in health, remember. But the wedding, Valerian protested. We will have to wait now. Theodora considered this, then shook her head. No, she signed, unless you wish to wait. Valerian was confused. How can we marry with me like this? A smile played at the corners of her mouth. The Reverend can come here. We can marry in this room with you in that bed if necessary. I did not come all this way to be stopped by a broken leg. Her determination was both amusing and touching. Are you sure? Valerian signed. It is not the wedding you deserve. It is exactly the wedding I deserve, she replied, because it will make me your wife. That is all that matters to me. In that moment, looking at her steadfast face in the lamplight, Valerian knew with certainty that he loved her. It wasn't the practical affection he had expected to develop over time, but something deeper and more immediate, a recognition of her spirit, her courage, her essential goodness. He wanted to tell her, but the words, or rather, the signs wouldn't come. It was too soon, he thought. She might not believe him, might think it was just the laudanum talking. So instead, he signed, then we will be married as planned. The next 3 days were a revelation for Valerian. Confined to his bed, he had no choice but to watch as Theodora took charge of the ranch. She enlisted the help of the Wilsons' teenage sons for the heavier work, but she herself managed the daily chores, feeding the livestock, collecting eggs from the chickens, preparing meals, and keeping the house in order. She also became Valerian's nurse, changing the bandages on his leg where the skin had been abraded in the fall, bringing him food and drink, helping him to the necessary when he needed to relieve himself. An awkward but unavoidable intimacy that she handled with matter-of-fact grace. Throughout it all, she maintained a cheerful demeanor, refusing to acknowledge the enormous burden that had been placed on her shoulders. When Valerian expressed concern, she would simply sign, "This is what partners do," and continue with whatever task she was performing. The day of their wedding arrived clear and cold, the first real hint of the Wyoming winter to come. Reverend Thompson arrived at midday, accompanied by the Wilsons, Dr. Morris, who had come to check on Valerian's leg anyway, and to Valerian's surprise, Mr. Jenkins, the schoolteacher. Theodora had transformed the bedroom as best she could for the occasion, placing vases of late-blooming wildflowers on the bureau and windowsill, and covering the utilitarian furniture with her few decorative items from home, a lace doily here, an embroidered runner there. She herself wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that set off her auburn hair, which she had arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. When she entered the room after changing, Valerian's breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was a radiance about her, a quiet joy that illuminated her from within. Reverend Thompson conducted the ceremony at Valerian's bedside. In a thoughtful gesture, he had written out the service in advance, so Theodora could follow along. When it came time for the vows, Valerian insisted on sitting up despite his pain. He wanted to make his promises to Theodora face to face, man to woman. The traditional vows took on new meaning as they were both spoken and signed. When Reverend Thompson said, "Repeat after me," Valerian spoke the words aloud for the benefit of the witnesses, but his hands simultaneously formed the signs that would convey his commitment to Theodora. "I, Valerian Lawson, take thee, Theodora Nichols, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." As he signed these solemn promises, Valerian realized that he meant every word with all his heart. This woman, who had traveled across a continent to marry a stranger, who had faced prejudice and hardship with unfailing courage, who had taken on the responsibility of a ranch, When he could not, she had earned not just his respect but his deepest love. When it was Theodora's turn, she signed her vows with graceful precision, while Mr. Jenkins, to Valerian's surprise, voiced the words aloud for the assembled witnesses. The schoolteacher had evidently taken it upon himself to learn enough sign language to perform this service, a kindness that brought tears to Theodora's eyes. I, Theodora Nichols, take thee, Valerian Lawson, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. They exchanged simple gold bands that Valerian had purchased in town before his accident. As Theodora slipped the ring onto his finger, her hand steady and sure, Valerian felt a sense of rightness, of completion, that he had never experienced before. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, Valerian pulled Theodora down for a kiss that was both gentle and filled with promise. The small gathering of witnesses applauded, and Theodora, though she couldn't hear the sound, felt the vibration of their approval through the floorboards. After a modest reception downstairs, where the Wilsons had helped prepare refreshments, the guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone. Despite his injury, Valerian insisted on observing one tradition he signed to Theodora, that a husband should carry his bride over the threshold of their bedroom. She laughed and shook her head, pointing to his splinted leg. But Valerian was determined. With her help, he managed to stand on his good leg and, leaning heavily on her shoulder, hopped to the doorway of their bedroom. There, summoning all his strength, he swept her into his arms for the brief moment it took to cross the threshold before he had to set her down again, his face pale with the effort. "That was foolish," she signed, her expression a mixture of exasperation and tenderness. "Worth it," he signed back, grimacing as she helped him back to the bed. That night, they lay side by side in Valerian's now their bed, the consummation of their marriage necessarily postponed until his leg healed. But there was an intimacy in their closeness, in the quiet conversation of their hands in the darkness, that was in its way as profound as any physical union. "Are you disappointed?" Valerian signed, referring to the modest wedding and the limitations imposed by his injury. Theodora shook her head, her hair spread like copper fire across the pillow. "I have everything I wanted," she signed. "A home, a husband, a future." Valerian hesitated, then signed the words he had been holding back. "I love you." In the soft glow of the bedside lamp, he saw tears well in her eyes. For a moment, he feared he had spoken too soon, that she didn't share his feelings. But then her hands formed the response that would forever change his life. "And I love you. I think I have from the first moment I saw you waiting at the train station." Valerian felt his own eyes grow damp. Gently, he pulled her closer, mindful of his injured leg, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that spoke more eloquently than either words or signs could do. The weeks of Valerian's recovery passed in a blur of quiet domesticity. Unable to perform his usual outdoor work, he turned his attention to tasks he could manage from his chair by the fire, mending harnesses, carving replacement handles for tools, keeping the ranch accounts in order. Theodora continued to manage the daily operation of the ranch with remarkable efficiency. She had developed a good working relationship with the Wilson sons, communicating through a combination of signs they had learned, written notes, and expressive gestures. Valerian used his enforced leisure to study the sign language dictionary Theodora had given him, mastering new signs each day. Their evening conversations became richer and more nuanced as his vocabulary expanded. He also began to teach Theodora about ranching, the cycles of the seasons, the care of cattle, the management of the land. She proved to be an apt pupil, asking insightful questions and quickly grasping concepts that had taken Valerian years to learn through trial and error. By the time Dr. Morris removed the splint from Valerian's leg 6 weeks after the accident, winter had settled over South Pass City. The first snows had fallen, transforming the landscape into a glittering white expanse that stretched to the horizon. Valerian's leg was stiff and weak from disuse, and he needed a cane to walk at first. Theodora became his physical therapist, encouraging him to exercise the leg gently but consistently, massaging the atrophied muscles to restore their strength. Their evenings by the fire took on a new dimension as Valerian's mobility improved. No longer bound by his injury, they could finally express their love in all its fullness. Theodora proved to be as passionate in her lovemaking as she was practical in her daily life, and Valerian discovered depths of tenderness in himself that he had never suspected existed. In those intimate moments, they developed a private language that went beyond formal signs: a touch here, a look there, a unique gesture that meant "I cherish you" or "You are my world." It was a language only they understood, born of their particular circumstances but transcending them. As winter deepened, they settled into a routine. Valerian gradually resumed his outdoor work as his strength returned, though Theodora insisted he continue to use the cane when the ground was icy. She focused on the indoor tasks of the ranch: cooking, cleaning, sewing, preserving what remained of the fall harvest. They made occasional trips into town for supplies, where they were now accepted as a couple. The initial curiosity about Lawson's deaf bride had given way to respect for Theodora's competence and the obvious devotion between husband and wife. Even Bartholomew Quinn, who had made the disparaging remarks after church, had changed his tune. His wife had apparently taken him to task for his unkindness, and he had made a point of approaching Valerian and Theodora in the general store one day to awkwardly apologize. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, speaking slowly and clearly so Theodora could read his lips, "I believe I may have spoken thoughtlessly when you first arrived in our town. I wish to express my regret and to say that you have proven to be an exemplary addition to our community." Theodora, always gracious, had nodded her acceptance of his apology, and Valerian had reluctantly shaken the man's extended hand. It wasn't full friendship, but it was a step toward the kind of acceptance that would make their lives easier in the small town. Christmas came, the first they would celebrate as a married couple. Valerian surprised Theodora with a new winter cloak, the material finer than anything she had owned before, lined with soft rabbit fur to ward off the Wyoming cold. She had tears in her eyes as she wrapped it around herself, signing that it was too extravagant. Valerian simply signed back, "Nothing is too good for my wife." Theodora's gift to him was equally thoughtful, a beautifully bound journal in which she had painstakingly copied out the most useful signs for ranch life, illustrated with small drawings to help him remember them. It was a labor of love that must have taken her weeks of secret work during the times he was out tending to the cattle. That Christmas evening, as they sat before the fire enjoying mugs of spiced cider, Valerian reflected on how completely his life had been transformed in just a few months. The emptiness that had driven him to advertise for a bride seemed like a distant memory. Now his days were filled with purpose, his nights with companionship, and his heart with a love he had never thought to find. As if sensing his thoughts, Theodora set down her mug and signed, "What are you thinking about? You look so serious." Valerian smiled and signed back, "I was thinking about how fortunate I am. How empty this house was before you came, how full it is now." Theodora's expression softened. "I am the fortunate one," she signed. You gave me a home when I had none. You learned my language when others wouldn't bother. You see me as whole when others see only what I lack." Valerian shook his head firmly. "You lack nothing," he signed. "Your deafness is not an absence but a difference. It has made you who you are: observant, resilient, compassionate, and I love who you are." Tears glistened in Theodora's eyes as she moved to kneel beside his chair. She took his hands and pressed them to her lips, then guided them to her abdomen. It took Valerian a moment to understand the significance of the gesture. "Are you?" he signed, unable to complete the sentence as emotion overwhelmed him. Theodora nodded, her face radiant with joy. "I believe so," she signed. "The signs are all there. We will have a child by summer's end." Valerian pulled her into his arms, his heart too full for words or even signs. A child, a family of his own. It was more than he had ever dared to hope for when he had placed that advertisement in the Eastern newspaper. As they held each other in the firelight, Valerian made a silent vow to ensure that their child, regardless of whether they could hear or not, would grow up knowing both languages, the spoken word and the language of signs. Their family would bridge both worlds, just as he and Theodora had bridged the silence between them. Spring came to Wyoming with its usual capricious nature days of warming sunshine, interspersed with sudden snowstorms that reminded everyone that winter wasn't quite ready to release its grip. As the land began to awaken, so did new life within Theodora. Her pregnancy, now obvious to both of them, brought changes to their routine. Valerian insisted that she reduce her workload, taking on more of the household tasks himself when he wasn't busy with the spring calving. Theodora protested that she wasn't an invalid, just expecting a child, but she did agree to rest more and to avoid the more strenuous chores. Their evening ritual of signing practice continued, but with a new focus. Valerian was determined to become as fluent as possible before the baby arrived. If their child inherited Theodora's deafness, a possibility they had discussed openly, he wanted to be able to communicate fully from the very beginning. But what if the baby can hear? Theodora signed one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. "Then our child will know both worlds," Valerian replied, "and will be richer for it." The thought seemed to comfort Theodora, who had confessed her fear that she might not be able to mother a hearing child properly. Valerian had dismissed this concern immediately, pointing out her remarkable ability to navigate a hearing world despite her own deafness. "You will be a wonderful mother," he assured her. "Our child will be blessed to have you." As Theodora's pregnancy progressed, they began to prepare the small room adjacent to theirs as a nursery. Valerian built a cradle from pine boards, carving intricate designs of wildflowers and prairie grasses into the headboard. Theodora sewed bedding and tiny garments, her needle flying with practiced precision. The community, now fully accepting of the unusual couple, contributed to the preparations. Eliza Wilson brought over a quilt she had made specifically for the new baby. Mrs. Peterson, the midwife, checked on Theodora regularly and brought herbal teas to help with the discomforts of pregnancy. Even Mr. Jenkins offered his assistance, promising to help them find books on childcare that would address the unique situation of a deaf mother. Summer arrived in a blaze of heat and activity. The ranch demanded constant attention, and despite Theodora's condition, she insisted on helping with the vegetable garden, which would provide much of their food for the coming winter. Valerian tried to persuade her to leave the work to him, but she was adamant that the gentle exercise was good for her. "The midwife says I should stay active," she signed when he protested. "Just not overheated or overtired." So they compromised, working in the garden together in the cool of early morning and late evening, avoiding the scorching midday sun. One evening in late July, as they were weeding the rows of beans and carrots, Theodora suddenly straightened up with a gasp, her hands flying to her swollen abdomen. Valerian was at her side instantly, his face a mask of concern. "What is it? Is it time?" he signed frantically, ready to run for the midwife, but Theodora was smiling. She took his hand and placed it on her belly. For a moment he felt nothing, and then a distinct movement, a firm push against his palm. "The baby is kicking," she signed, her face alight with wonder. "I've felt flutters before, but this is different." Valerian knelt in the dirt beside her, both hands now spread across her abdomen, marveling at the evidence of life beneath his fingers. The baby kicked again, a strong, healthy movement that brought tears to his eyes. In that moment, the reality of impending fatherhood struck him with full force. Soon, very soon, there would be a new person in their lives, a tiny being who would depend on them completely, who would learn from them, who would carry forward the love they had built between them. "Hello, little one," he signed against Theodora's belly, though he knew the baby couldn't see it. "We can't wait to meet you." Theodora laughed silently at his gesture, but her eyes were soft with love. She placed her hands over his, and they remained like that until the light faded from the sky and the evening chill reminded them it was time to go inside. August brought relentless heat, making Theodora's final weeks of pregnancy especially uncomfortable. She moved through her days with increasing difficulty, her normally graceful movements hampered by her unwieldy form. Valerian did everything he could to ease her discomfort, bringing her cool cloths for her forehead, massaging her swollen ankles, taking over more and more of her usual tasks. He even rigged a sort of shower outside using a barrel elevated on stilts, which provided blessed relief from the heat when she stood beneath its spray. The baby was due any day, according to Mrs. Peterson's calculations. The midwife had moved into their spare room for the time being, not wanting to risk being too far away when labor began. It happened in the dead of night, 3 days past the estimated date. Valerian was awakened by Theodora's hand on his shoulder, shaking him urgently. When he opened his eyes, he saw her face contorted in pain, her nightgown damp with sweat. "The baby," she signed as soon as she had his attention. "It's coming." Valerian leaped from the bed, nearly tripping in his haste, and ran to wake Mrs. Peterson. The midwife was already up, as if she had sensed the impending birth. She calmly directed Valerian to heat water and gather clean linens, while she went to examine Theodora. The labor was long and difficult. Unlike hearing women, who could be coached through their contractions with verbal encouragement, Theodora had to rely on touch and sight. Valerian remained by her side throughout, signing encouragement when she could focus on his hands, and simply holding her when the pain was too great for communication. Mrs. Peterson proved to be remarkably adaptive, quickly learning to touch Theodora's arm to get her attention, and using exaggerated facial expressions and gestures to convey her instructions. As dawn broke over the prairie, Theodora's ordeal intensified. Valerian felt helpless as he watched her struggle, unable to share her pain or take it from her. All he could do was support her physically, letting her grip his hands with bruising force during contractions, and emotionally, signing "I love you" and "you're so strong" whenever her eyes met his. Just as the sun cleared the horizon, casting golden light through the bedroom window, Theodora gave a final, mighty push, and their child entered the world with a lusty cry that she couldn't hear, but could feel as a vibration against her body, as Mrs. Peterson placed the infant on her chest. "A boy," the midwife announced to Valerian, who was staring in wonder at the squalling, red-faced creature that was his son. A strong, healthy boy. Theodora was weeping silently, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the baby's tiny fingers, his damp hair, his wrinkled face. Valerian leaned down to kiss her forehead, his own tears mingling with hers. "He's perfect," he sighed, though she was too absorbed in examining their son to notice. After the birth, while Mrs. Peterson helped Theodora clean up and settle more comfortably in bed, Valerian took his son to the window. The baby had quieted now, his eyes a deep blue that might change with time open and seemingly alert, despite being only minutes old. "Welcome to the world, Thomas," Valerian whispered, speaking the name they had chosen if the baby was a boy, after Theodora's father. "Your mother is the strongest, bravest woman I've ever known, and she's going to love you more than you can imagine. And his voice caught on a sudden sob of joy, "I'm going to do my best to be a good father to you." Whether by coincidence or some nascent recognition, the baby's tiny hand closed around Valerian's finger at that moment, gripping with surprising strength. It felt like a promise, a covenant between father and son. When Valerian brought Thomas back to Theodora, she was sitting up against the pillows, her face pale but radiant with the unique glow of new motherhood. She held out her arms for the baby, and as Valerian placed him in her embrace, he was struck by the rightness of the tableau they created, mother and child, a bond as old as humanity itself, transcending the barriers of silence and sound. Over the next few days, as Theodora recovered her strength and they began to adjust to life with a newborn, they discovered something remarkable. Thomas, barely a week old, seemed unusually responsive to visual stimuli. When Theodora signed over his cradle, his eyes followed the movement of her hands with an intensity that Mrs. Peterson, who had attended hundreds of births, found noteworthy. "Hearing babies usually respond more to sounds than to sights at this age," she remarked to Valerian. "It's too early to tell for certain, but—" She left the implication hanging. Valerian and Theodora discussed the possibility that their son might be deaf like his mother. Rather than feeling dismay, as some might expect, they approached the prospect with equanimity. If Thomas was deaf, he would have the advantage that Theodora never had parents who could communicate with him from the start, who understood his experience of the world. And if he could hear, they were equally prepared to embrace that reality. Valerian would speak to him, read to him, introduce him to the world of sound, while Theodora would ensure he knew the language of signs as well, creating a bridge between their two worlds. As it turned out, Thomas could hear. The proof came one morning when he was about 3 weeks old. Valerian was chopping wood outside the kitchen window while Theodora sat inside, nursing the baby. A particularly loud crack as the axe split a log caused Thomas to startle and pull away from the breast, his eyes wide. Theodora, not having heard the sound, was puzzled by his reaction until she glanced up and saw Valerian through the window with the axe. Understanding dawned, and when Valerian came inside a few minutes later, she signed to him excitedly. "He heard you." The axe, he heard it. They tested this discovery with other sounds, Valerian clapping his hands behind the baby's head, ringing a small bell, whistling a tune. Each time, Thomas responded with the typical reactions of a hearing infant: startle, curiosity, sometimes displeasure if the sound was too loud or unexpected. The confirmation brought a mix of emotions. Valerian was secretly relieved that his son would not face the challenges Theodora had encountered, yet he was also aware of a subtle shift in the family dynamic. Thomas would inhabit primarily the world of sound that was closed to his mother. But Theodora, ever practical, simply adjusted her approach. She began to sign constantly to the baby, even when he was too young to understand, ensuring that visual language would be as natural to him as the spoken word would become. And Valerian, true to his promise, made sure that Thomas heard the sound of his voice throughout each day, talking, singing, even reading aloud from books in the evening, while Theodora watched and signed the same stories, creating a seamless blend of both languages. As Thomas grew from newborn to infant to toddler, their home became a place where two languages, one of sound, one of sight, coexisted in perfect harmony. By the time he was 2, Thomas was both signing and beginning to speak, moving effortlessly between his father's verbal world and his mother's visual one. His first spoken word was "Pa," directed at Valerian one morning as they sat at the breakfast table. Valerian was so overcome with emotion that he could barely acknowledge the milestone, simply gathering his son into his arms and holding him close. His first sign, however, had come months earlier, a crude but recognizable approximation of "Mama" that had brought tears to Theodora's eyes and a fierce pride to Valerian's heart. Their son was truly a child of both worlds. The ranch prospered as the years passed. Valerian, with Theodora's astute management, expanded their holdings and increased their herd. They built a larger house when Thomas was 4, with room for the additional children they hoped would come. They did. A daughter, Sarah, born 2 years after Thomas, and another son, James, 2 years after that. Both children, like their older brother, could hear, but like him, they grew up bilingual in spoken English and sign language. The Lawson children became known in South Pass City for their ability to interpret for their mother, smoothly translating conversations for her in social settings. They showed no embarrassment about her deafness, accepting it as simply one aspect of their remarkable mother, who could ride as well as any man, run a household with precision, and communicate volumes with the eloquent movements of her hands. The town itself had changed over the years. The gold that had first attracted settlers to South Pass City had played out, causing some to move on to more promising locations. But others, like the Lawsons, had put down roots, building a community that endured beyond the boom and bust cycle of mining towns. As the children grew, Valerian and Theodora made sure they understood their heritage. They told them the story of how they had met the mail-order bride arrangement, Valerian's shock at discovering Theodora's deafness, his determination to learn her language, their growing love amid the challenges of frontier life. "Your father learned to speak with his hands because he wanted to tell me he loved me," Theodora would sign to the children. "And that's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me except for you 3. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Valerian surprised Theodora with a trip back east. It was the first time she had returned to Boston since coming west as a bride, and the first time the children had seen a city larger than Cheyenne. They visited the school where Theodora had learned to sign, now expanded and flourishing. The headmistress, an elderly woman who remembered Theodora as a student, wept when she saw how well she had fared in life, a husband who could sign, 3 children who moved seamlessly between the deaf and hearing worlds, a confidence that came from being truly valued. "We owe much of this to you," Valerian told the headmistress, both speaking and signing so Theodora could follow the conversation. "The foundation you gave her made our life together possible." The headmistress shook her head. "No," she replied, also using both speech and sign. "What made it possible was your willingness to enter her world rather than demanding she adapt completely to yours. That is rarer than you might think." As they traveled back to Wyoming, Valerian reflected on those words. It had never occurred to him to do otherwise. Learning to sign had been a necessity, Yes, but also a joy the key to unlocking a relationship that had enriched his life beyond measure. Their return to the ranch coincided with Thomas's announcement that he wished to study medicine. At 17, he had grown into a thoughtful young man with his father's height and his mother's keen observational skills. "I want to work with deaf children," he explained over dinner, "to help them the way Mother was helped, and to help hearing families understand their deaf children better." Valerian and Theodora exchanged a look of pride and satisfaction. Their son had absorbed the lesson of their marriage that differences need not divide, that communication could bridge any gap, that love expressed through effort and understanding was the strongest love of all. As they sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and gold, Theodora leaned her head against Valerian's shoulder. Her hair, still abundant though now streaked with silver, caught the fading light as it had on that first day at the train station. "Happy?" Valerian signed, though he knew the answer from the contentment in her eyes. She straightened to reply, her hands moving in the graceful patterns that had become as natural to him as breathing. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she signed. "When I came west, I hoped for security, perhaps companionship. I never expected to find a man who would learn a new language just to say, 'I love you.'" Valerian smiled and lifted his hands to sign the words that had become the cornerstone of their life together. But this time he signed them slowly, savoring each movement, investing each gesture with the depth of feeling that 15 years of marriage had only strengthened. "I love you," his hand said. "Yesterday, today, tomorrow, always." Theodora's eyes, as expressive as they had been when she was a young bride, filled with tears of joy. She raised her own hands to respond, but instead leaned forward to kiss him, a response that needed no translation in any language. As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, their hands occasionally moving in quiet conversation. Two people who had found in each other the perfect complement, the missing piece that made them whole. In the distance, coyotes began their evening chorus, a sound Theodora would never hear. But she didn't need to. She felt the vibration of Valerian's gentle laughter as he pointed them out to her, and she saw the silhouettes of the wild creatures against the moonlit prairie, their presence as much a part of the tapestry of their life together as the sign language that had bridged the silence between them. In the language of hands, they had written a love story as vast and enduring as the western landscape that had brought them together, a cowboy and his deaf mail-order bride, whose courage and determination had created not just a marriage but a legacy of understanding that would echo through generations to come.